welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm back in Hampstead today, a very leafy and affluent part of North London, replete with charming old buildings. I have actually covered Hampstead in a video before, however, I'm not sure I really did Hampstead justice. And there were a couple of pubs, quite famous ones, like the Spaniards here, that I missed out because I thought possibly their modern incarnations were a bit too gastro, but on reflection, I think their histories are actually pretty interesting. Cheers from the Spaniards Inn. It's a listed building, and Historic England are of the opinion it's originally 17th century. Pevsner, on the other hand, pins it to the 18th century and described it as a picturesque corner which has happily defied road widening. It's mainly in whitewashed brick, but there is also some timber framing and some parts are weatherboarded there round the side. Historic England's listing summarises it as an altered building, but one that still has great character. It's quite possibly contemporary with this smaller building immediately across the road, which was once a toll house. The pair of them do make for quite an appealing scene, which has been remarkably unchanged throughout the ages. Compare, for example, to this depiction which appears in Walter Thornbury's Old and New London, first published in 1873, or this one which dates to around 1878 and shows a bit more of a toll house. It's also on CAMERA's list of historic pub interiors, albeit that some parts of it are interwar rather than anything much older. CAMERA suggests the best room is upstairs, now called the Keats Dining Room, wherein they describe the floor-to-ceiling panelling as ancient. I think that's echoed in the brief mention of the interior in the Historic England listing, where I think they're suggesting it may be original. So possibly even 17th century, albeit that it's much painted now, so perhaps hard to say for sure. There's also a 1930s brick fireplace here and bare bench seating in the windows. The other room upstairs is called the Dickens Room and doesn't feel quite as venerable. Regrettably, there's a certain amount of turquoise paint here. Downstairs, CAMERA also point out the two small rooms on the east end of the building, one of which I sat in to do some of the talking bits. Some of the panelling here is also very old. We could again be talking 18th century. I find the idea of it being 17th century a bit of a stretch, but some parts are more likely 1930s. It seems pretty much everything else, the flooring, the bar counter, the bar back, is all modern, alas, but I do think it has been quite nicely done in dark wood, and there's some nice bits of carving to be found, including on the end of these benches. I think these are called baffles, and on this cabinet here. The name, the Spaniards Inn, is quite an unusual one, and nobody seems to quite agree on the derivation. There's fanciful talk of Spanish ambassadors retreating to the neighbourhood for fresh air, and two Spanish brothers duelling over a woman, but the simplest explanation is usually the most likely to be true. The Victoria History of the County of Middlesex, published in 1911, may be the original source of the most down-to-earth theory, simply that it once had a Spanish landlord. Apparently, licensing records show that Francis Pereiro was the landlord in 1721, although I haven't seen the record myself. I believe it's now held at the London Metropolitan Archives. On John Rock's map of 1746, although the pub itself isn't labelled, the combination, I suppose, of the pub and the toll gate is labelled as Spaniards Gate, so the name in some form was already clearly in existence at that time. There are supposedly Dick Turpin associations with this pub, something that always needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, including a claim that possibly his father was one of the pub's landlords. A more generally accepted version of the events surrounding Dick Turpin's early life is that his father was an innkeeper of a pub in Hampstead in Essex, which I suppose is easy to confuse with Hampstead in Middlesex as it was then. However, it's fair to say in the 18th century that highwaymen were active in the area. The Spaniards is mentioned in the Proceedings of the Old Bailey in 1751, which is the earliest record that clearly identifies the pub itself that I've seen. That's for the case of Samuel Bacon, who was found guilty of highway robbery. One of the most famous historical associations of the pub is with the Gordon riots of 1780, a period of unrest driven by anti-Catholic sentiment. At the time, William Murray, 1st Earl of Mansfield, was Lord Chief Justice, and he was targeted by the rioters for his perceived leniency towards those of a papal inclination. The story goes that after ransacking and partly demolishing Lord Mansfield's townhouse in Bloomsbury, the mob proceeded to do the same at his nearby country seat, Kenwood House. However, they stopped off en route at the Spaniards Inn for refreshment, wherein the landlord deliberately waylaid them, plied them with free beer, and meanwhile sent for soldiers to come and deal with them. Thus Kenwood House and Lord Mansfield were saved. Nice though the story is, I'm a bit sceptical given the lack of any contemporary accounts. I found plenty of newspaper coverage at the time of the attack on Lord Mansfield's Bloomsbury townhouse, and there are records of court proceedings for the ensuing prosecutions as well. However, the closest I could find to any contemporary mention of an attempted assault on Kenwood House is this brief note in a newspaper that there had been rumours of it and that they were unfounded. I could not find a full retelling of the supposed waylaying of the mob at the Spaniards Inn until Frederick Prickett's 1842 book on the history and antiquities of Highgate, so I think it's highly likely the story had, at the very least, been somewhat embellished in the preceding 6 decades. There are some literary associations with the pub, and I believe that's why we have a Keats and a Dickens dining room upstairs. The pub is mentioned by name, the Spaniards, or the Spaniard in the singular, I think sometimes in the Pickwick Papers, the first instalment of which was published in 1836. Mrs. Bardell has a tea party here, and I believe is also arrested while she's on the premises. There's an illustration of that scene from a later edition, although it doesn't really show you much about the pub itself. Dickens stayed at nearby Wilds Farm in 1837, partway through writing the Pickwick Papers, and so I believe that particular instalment would probably have been written while he was staying in the area. Today the pub is operated by Mitchells and Butlers. It's part of their Castle brand, the one that they use for particularly historic pubs. As noted earlier, I think the majority of the trade today is more food oriented, but you still very much can come here just for a pint. I went for a half of Timothy Taylor's Boltmaker, and here is a look at the rest of the beers on offer on the hand pumps on the bar. The most direct route to the next pub, the Old Bull and Bush, is straight across the heath, or I think this is the Hampstead Heath extension, so it's nice to have a bit of greenery to space these pubs out. Pub number 2, and as possibly just noted, a short walk across the heath, the Old Bull and Bush. Cheers from the Old Bull and Bush. The building we see today is a 1920s Neo-Georgian rebuild, apparently at least somewhat in keeping with the style of the original, which presumably would have been therefore genuinely Georgian. It is a listed building, so there are copious notes from historic England, but I'll pick out a couple of things that I thought were quite interesting about the frontage. Note in particular the fire insurance plate. It's a slightly unusual one. I think we're more used to seeing Sunfire Office insurance plates. There was one of those back at the Spaniards, but this is actually from the Hand in Hand fire insurance company. That company ceased to exist in 1905, so presumably this plate was actually transferred from the earlier building. Beneath that is a Venetian, as it's described in the Historic England listing, or I would call that a Palladian window, a central arch with 2 symmetrical flanking windows. Looking at an image from before the rebuild, I think this is from the Edwardian era. Interestingly, those 2 sphinxes that we see today were present then as well, so I wonder if, like that fire insurance plate, they were also transferred from the earlier building. On the inside, it is frankly an eyesore. There's just no way I can be polite about this. Really particular hideous use of turquoisey Farrow and Ball, probably, or whatever paint. I think that refit happened around 2006. The Historic England listing for the building is from 1974, and that says that the interior retains old features and good interwall fittings, presumably from that 1930s rebuild. I don't think any of those are anywhere to be seen today, or at least if they are, they're very well hidden by the turquoise paint. The name is interesting, and there's a few Bull and something pubs in the broader area around Hampstead Heath. Think of the Bull and Last and the Bull and Mouth in Kentish Town as examples. The Bush part of a pub name apparently, possibly, goes back to the ancient custom of Roman tabernae, where they would hang some cluster of foliage, possibly vine leaves originally, outside a house to denote that it sold wine. And the bull can, in some cases, actually relate to a papal bull, an order from the Pope, rather than the bull, the animal. Not clear in this case where exactly those 2 components of the name, the bull and the bush, came from. Again, some connection with highwaymen here, and there is an account in 1722 of the trial of Thomas Etheridge that relates to the pub. I think the trial relates to events from the previous year, 1721, so we know that the pub would have existed at that time. And there is actually a date in the Historic England listing for the likely establishment of the pub, or when the pub was first known, as 1721, and I suspect that comes from this account. The pub's main claim to fame is that it is immortalised in a music hall song, Down at the Old Bull and Bush, which was written for Florrie Ford. I assume this was late Victorian, possibly early Edwardian. She died in 1940, I believe. And there is a copy of both the words, the lyrics to the song on the inside of the pub, and also a picture of the lady herself, Florrie Ford. This is another Mitchell's and Butler's pub, I believe, today, and it is very much given over to dining. Just 2 hand pumps on the bar, both of those serving London Pride, so unsurprisingly I went for a half of that. Not exactly a walk across open countryside to the next pub, but there is this very leafy lane to walk down. I think this is called North End Way. The path is elevated and the actual road is down there, which is nice. Our third port of call today, Jack Straw's Castle. Unfortunately, long since closed. I believe it closed as a pub in 2002. Had a brief spell maybe as more of a restaurant, and then was converted into a gym for a while, possibly had some office use as well. And now it's been converted into residential use. I think it's a block of apartments. The building we see today actually dates to the 1960s and was designed by Raymond Erith. Apparently John Betjeman was a fan. However, earlier incarnations of the pub are known to have existed as early as 1713. Here's a depiction in Walter Thornbury's Old and New London of the pub prior to that 1960s rebuild. I think this is sometime in the 1890s, this sketch. The name is a reference to one of the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt. I believe Jack Straw was the deputy leader of that movement. And the legend goes that he either hid here or was captured here or made a speech on the back of a hay wagon here, or some combination of all three. The earliest written reference I found to it is in 1776 in a poem published in the London Review. Is that possibly the forerunner of the publication we know today as the London Review of Books? And the pub gets a mention in the 1796 book titled Eccentric Excursions as a well-known haunt of toffs coming out from London for a day trip. There is an accompanying sketch of those toffs on their day out from London, and there's also a mention that the skittle ground attached to the pub at that time was popular with members of the lower orders. That also has a slightly pejorative accompanying sketch as well. Pub number 4, or number 3 if we're not counting the one which was closed, the Hollybush. Cheers from the Hollybush. I'd forgot this is quite a difficult pub to film at. There isn't really much outside space. There's just one bench out the front and this bit of standing room with a drink shelf. So this is a listed building, and Historic England believe it to date to 1797. That's unusually precise. I think it occupies a very appealing setting in this little corner of Hollymount, and the best way of accessing it is one of the 2, I think, steps that lead up from Heath Street. One is called Hollybush Steps and one is called Hollymount Steps. As it happens on my visit, one of those is actually closed for maintenance, but very atmospheric. I don't think any of those are still functioning gas lights, but they're probably replaced with electric now, sadly. The building is stucco rendered and has this canopy which runs over much of the ground floor frontage. It has a wooden pelmet around the base of that canopy as described in the Historic England listing. Inside, the pub is on camera's list of historic pub interiors. The right-hand room as you enter is the main bar room today. Much of the rest of the internal space now is given over to dining, but that still functions very much as a pub, that room on the right. Both the bar counter and the bar back are quite possibly Victorian survivors, so they don't go back to the very earliest days of the pub, but they do survive from probably the late Victorian period. And there is a testament to the fact that this was at one time a Benskin's Brewery pub with a large mirror. On the left-hand side as you come in is a room that camera's listing says has even more atmosphere than the main bar room, and it's known originally as the coffee room. You can see that in the glazing at the exterior, and there is also an ornate iron fire surround. Towards the back of the pub are some additional dining rooms. Possibly they came into use later and weren't originally part of the pub. There has been some confusing reporting about the history of the pub, particularly surrounding how old it actually is. The Wikipedia article states that it became a pub in 1928 and cites as a source for that an article in Time Out not an outlet generally known for its historical writing, so I think that definitely needs to be taken with a very large pinch of salt. Other sources claim that Samuel Johnson used to drink here, but he died in 1784, and I don't think it actually became a pub until some time after that. A sketch of the pub appears in The Artist in 1898, although it's a bit vague and it's quite hard to make out. There is a suggestion in the text accompanying that the pub was a one-time studio and or possibly stables of George Romney, the artist who owned the house that still stands today at the back of the pub, and I believe there is a plaque attesting to that. Romney died in 1802, and this section of the building, the stables/studio, became the Hampstead Assembly Rooms in 1807, and we're told that the part that now forms the pub was the catering wing thereof. And the earliest reference I could find to it as a pub is this newspaper mention of 1811. So sometime between 1807 and 1811, I think this pub became a pub. Ford Madox Brown's painting titled Work, which I think was completed in either 1863 or 1865, depending on which version you're looking at, depicts a scene just round the corner from here on Mount Street. Martin Cornell wrote an article wherein he suggests that the potboy pictured there, all of these characters are identified in notes written about the painting by Madox Brown, would actually have come from the Hollybush. It seems quite likely, as this was the closest pub to that scene. Coincidentally, in that article, Martin Cornell also mentions that he was born close to here in the Queen's House, as it's now called, hospital up the road, which was the former site of the Upper Flask, and we'll get onto that later. Sadly, Martin Cornell passed away earlier this year, but his incredible writing lives on. I'm happy to say that the Zethophile blog that he'd maintained is still live, so you can still enjoy his meticulously researched articles about beer and pubs. I'll put a link to that in the description. Let's quickly look at the name, the Hollybush. It seems that the name of these surrounding streets came first. The pub's address today is still on Holly Mount, which leads off Hollybush Hill, and there's also a Hollybush Steps, as mentioned earlier, to cut up from Heath Street. The earliest written reference I could find to Hollybush Hill is in 1786 in a London guide. The name apparently derives from a grove of holly bushes, which was still here up until the 1940s, and you can see them possibly depicted here on the 1890s OS map. As noted, this was a Benskins brewery pub until they were acquired by Inn Coop in 1957, and it's been a Fuller's pub since 2010. Here is a look at what was on the bar lineup, and I once again went for a half of London Pride. Pub number 5, I think this is, the Duke of Hamilton. Cheers from the Duke of Hamilton. This is the first building we're encountering today that is not listed, possibly one of the only ones of all the pubs we'll be looking at in Hampstead today, which is curious. So I'm having to fly somewhat solo in terms of guessing the date of this, but I think this is probably an 18th century building. It does look quite Georgian with those flat brick arches and so on. Curiously, even though the pub building itself is not listed, the former stables of the pub are. They now face onto, I think it's called Elm Row, which is behind the pub, and they've been converted into a run of 3 cottages. Since I first knew this pub in about the year 2000, it has undergone at least one major refurbishment, so it's quite a bit different from how I remember it in those early days. It was wonderfully old-fashioned sort of pub carpet and red bunket seating and all that kind of stuff back then, but it is a bit different today. It's been somewhat modernised. I wonder if they actually have, in a slightly unusual Frankenstein-y kind of way, preserved some aspects of the original bar counter. At first glance, it looks very, very modern, but if you look at some of the woodwork there, and particularly in the bar back, it does look a bit older. They obviously did preserve some parts of the woodwork behind the bar. That actually could be a bit older. I don't know if that would go back to all the way to, say, the Victorian era, but it certainly is a little bit older than the 21st century refurb. It does also have this very nice space out the back. I'm sitting in the front in this sort of courtyard, very nice terrace out the front as well, but there's this lovely space out the back, I think covered by a tarpaulin some of the time, and that would have been the stable yard, I suppose, and we have those listed stables behind, even though the pub itself doesn't qualify to be listed. Let's talk a bit about the pub name. The consensus seems to be that it was named for the 4th Duke of Hamilton, who died in an infamous duel in Hyde Park in 1712. His opponent, Baron Mohun, was also killed in the duel, and it's believed to have been a fight over a disputed inheritance, although some later commentators suggested that there may have been an underlying political motivation. One was a Tory, one was a Whig. It's not clear what exact connection the Duke had to either the pub or Hampstead more broadly, but sometimes in cases like this, the pub was started by a former member of that deceased aristocrat's staff. Anyway, the timing for that more or less fits with the accounts that this pub was established in 1721. I struggle to find any written records for it from the 18th century. The earliest I managed to find is in Holden's triennial directory that covers the period from 1805 to 1807. When I first knew this pub in, I think, around the year 2000, it was still a bit of a haunt for lovies, typically out-of-work actors who lived in Hampstead. And I think probably a bit before that, it had famous associations with some very often to be found in the pub great names of the stage and the screen, like Oliver Reed, Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton. It's a wonder sometimes that any of them managed to actually get any acting done with the amount of time they spent propping up bars. 2 hand pumps in service on the bar. One was serving cider and the other was serving Southwold bitter, and this is in particularly good shape, I have to say. Pub number 6, and it's just a stone's throw from the Duke of Hamilton. This is the Old White Bear. Cheers from the White Bear. The pub we see today is a neo-Georgian rebuild of around 1930, but it's on the site of a much older pub going back to the early 1700s. I've actually seen some floor plans of that 1930 rebuild. At that time, the public bar was the space over to the right as you came through the door, and presumably therefore the section over to the left would have been the saloon bar. The matchboard panelled bar counter with sloping sides and a curved corner certainly looks quite 1930s in style, but looking at some older photos, I think that actually has been installed, or who knows, possibly even reinstated in relatively recent years. I first came here in April 2009, and I remember it being a surprisingly homely, down-to-earth sort of a pub, quite not what I was expecting for Hampstead. I believe possibly even that year, however, it was converted to a restaurant, a very gastro pub, and I don't think very much of the interior survived that refurbishment, alas. However, the current owners, who I believe took it on actually within this decade, it was around 2021 when it reopened under their tenure, have tried to reinstate a bit of a pubby feel. The previous pub building, which that 1930 rebuild replaced, had a slate on it giving a date of 1704, and I think that's often cited as when the pub was first established. The earliest reference I found to a white bear in Hampstead is in the Weekly Journal or Saturday's Post, and that dates to 1721, which is tantalisingly close to that date of 1704, so I think that is quite credible. The Dictionary of Pub Names says that the White Bear is usually a heraldic reference to the Dukes of Kent, and that possibly explains why there was a ship of that name which fought against the Spanish Armada. That ship was rebuilt in 1599 and finally decommissioned in 1629. A couple of pubs in Yorkshire have taken their name from the ship, one possibly even having used some of the ship's timbers in its construction. Possibly instead here, it could have been some connection to the Earls of Warwick. The ancient heraldic device of that lineage is the bear and ragged staff, and sometimes that bear is rendered in white. There do seem to be some local connections to the Earls of Warwick, perhaps a bit tenuous, roughly around the time the pub is believed to have been established in 1704. Edward Rich, the 6th Earl of Warwick, died in 1701. He had been a friend of Baron Mohun, who he encountered at the Duke of Hamilton. The Earl was similarly involved in controversy around duelling. After he died, his wife married Joseph Addison, one of the founders of The Spectator, which we'll get to at the Flask later. The other founder of The Spectator, Richard Steele, had a cottage nearby in Belsize Park. Later in the 1750s, the Upper Flask came into the ownership of another member of that family, Lady Charlotte Rich. So all a bit tenuous, but there do seem to be some connections to the Earls of Warwick in the area. This pub's had a long period of closure in recent history. As noted, I was here in 2009, which turned out to be on the cusp of it closing and being converted into a restaurant. I think it lingered on as a restaurant until 2014, until it then closed altogether. A very extended period of closure until 2021 when it finally reopened, and during that period of closure it had been threatened with conversion into a residential property. The locals rallied round, managed to get it asset of community value status. It's now run by the Northern Union Pub Company, a small pub co which runs just a handful of pubs across North London, and we've seen some of those in recent videos on this channel, including the Albert in Primrose Hill, the Crown in Highgate, the Haverstock Tavern in Belsize Park, and the Winchester also in Highgate. In its current incarnation, it does seem to be well regarded for its real ale offering. I think there have been some plaudits from camera attesting to that. It's in the Good Beer Guide, as you can see from the hand pumps there. Here's a look at what was on the hand pumps. I went for a pint, apparently, of Harvey's Sussex Best. Incredibly reasonably priced. I think they have discounts in the week, Mondays to Thursdays possibly. And this was a mere £4 a pint, which almost seemed like a mistake for Hampstead, but very much enjoying this. Pub number 7, the Wells Tavern, and I have to admit I haven't done any research about this place and I was a little bit reluctant to include it at all. Camera's notes describe it as the most gastro of all gastro pubs in NW3. I think I have been inside once years ago and I remember it somewhat fitting to that description. Do I really want to go and take a look? I don't know. I decided I ought to give this a go, give it the benefit of the doubt. It's a handsome building, isn't it? And I believe it dates to 1849, so early Victorian, and there aren't that many early Victorian pub buildings given that crazy boom towards the end of the Victorian era where they decided to rebuild everything. Very quick look at the interior. It is very modern and very gastro on the inside, but I will say they had 2 hand pumps on. One was a sort of pale ale that wouldn't really be my cup of tea. The other is, I think this is from, is it Gorgeous Brewery? And it's Glowfly, sold as a bitter. I'm always a bit sceptical when I see a modern brewery selling a bitter that they're trying to secretly shoehorn some Cascade or Citra hops into unreceptive drinkers like me, but I believe this is actually East Kent Goldings and Fuggles, very safe territory. It's definitely not grapefruity, and I think that's actually pretty nice. Staff are also very nice as well, so perhaps I've been slightly unfair on the Wells Tavern. I think most of the time it is pretty much given over to dining. There are salt and pepper shakers even on the outside tables, but you know, clearly I am demonstrably just having a pint here or a half pint here without having to order food, so it does still on some level function as a pub. Pub number 7, the Flask. Cheers from the Flask. The pub we see today is a rebuild of 1874, and it's the work of architects Cumming and Nixon, who I don't think I've ever seen any other pubs attributed to, so this may have just been a one-off for them. Although we have many Victorian pubs in London, most of them tend to date from the bubble at the end of the Victorian era, from the 1890s onwards, so it's relatively rare to find a pub from this, I suppose we could call this mid-Victorian era, the 1870s. In the 1870s, we start to get a bit of stucco ornamentation, a little bit of classical design coming in, but it's all quite restrained and relatively tasteful, I think. We can see those classical touches here in the pilasters around the ground floor frontage, and also the paterae, these plate-like mouldings, these circular mouldings above those pilasters. But the main draw of this pub is in its interior, and it gets onto camera's list of historic pub interiors. The star of the show has to be the timber and glass partition which divides the 2 main bar rooms. As you enter, it would have been the public bar on the left and the saloon bar over on the right hand side, and you can see a distinction in the decoration on the partition. On the left hand side, it's mostly just the etched glass, kept relatively simple. I think they have some more modern prints put on top of those. On the right hand side are these chromo lithographs of paintings of the 1880s, some of them possibly early 1890s. Camera's notes on the interior identified 2 of the artists responsible for those 5 paintings there, but in an act of what can only be described as obsessive compulsive disorder, I went and found out who the other 3 were attributed to. The first one closest to the street, and this one was identified by camera, is by an artist from Belgium called Jan van Beers, a very appropriate artist for someone doing pub art. There's even a signature in the bottom right hand corner with a partly obscured date which suggests this is from the 1880s. I believe this piece is titled Peace with Honour. Contemporary reviews weren't particularly flattering, as in this one in the 1885 magazine called Truth. Therein it is described as such: a horribly stiff and garish guardsman and a nursery girl, perhaps another joke. It is really a pity that Van Beers should so waste his undoubted talents, for if he would give up painting his smirking, sprawling cocottes in favour of something more refined and original, he is perfectly capable of making not only a noise, but a name, and of turning out works that would live. The second from the left appears to be John Morgan's Glee, a pair of skipping girls. Morgan died around 1885, so that work can't have been any later than that. The third middle painting of a young woman looking out to sea is, again as identified by camera's notes, John William Godward's Wistful. It likely depicts Rosie Pettigrew, or Rose Pettigrew, who was a much sought after model in her day and was painted several times by Godward as well as other artists such as Whistler. The fourth seems to be described as after John Morgan, i.e. another artist aping his style, and is titled The Band. And finally, the fifth is William Adolphe Bouguereau's, not quite sure how to pronounce that, a French name, I assume. The painting is called The Harvest of Hazelnuts. That dates to 1883 and was likely a companion piece to his more famous work, The Nut Gatherers, which today hangs in the Detroit Institute of Arts. I think both pieces actually depict the same two girls. Shouldn't let all of the attention be grabbed by that series of 5 chromolithographs. There is also more interest in the rest of that partition. There is an archway that extends over the servery and that has a clock above it. On the saloon bar side, the same side as where those chromolithographs are, there is a mahogany bar counter and bar back, which camera believes to be original. On the other side, in the public bar, that has been expanded from its original size, apparently. It incorporated what was previously a private bar. There is, as camera describe it, a particularly eccentric column capital in that room. And finally, towards the back of the pub, there is a room that was brought into use in the interwar period, and that has a characteristically 1930s style bar counter. We should talk about the name, the Flask. It is much recounted that this comes from people coming to Hampstead Heath, which has a number of springs to take the waters. It's chalybeate water, similar to that at Tunbridge Wells, and was considered to have health-giving properties, particularly as a hangover cure. And the desirability of these waters had been reported as early as 1700 in a publication called The Postman. Several pubs dotted around Hampstead Heath took the name The Flask. There is still famously one over in Highgate as well, and there were originally 2 here. This was termed the Lower Flask to differentiate it from the, at the time, possibly more famous and certainly slightly more prestigious Upper Flask. Here's a depiction of the Upper Flask, or at least a building that it formerly occupied in around 1800. It actually ceased to be a pub in around 1750 and became a private residence from then on. That site was eventually sold on to build the Queen Mary Hospital, and that building still exists today. One of the oft-cited earliest mentions of the Lower Flask here is in a publication called The Spectator, which ran from 1711 to 1712 and is not to be confused with the magazine of that name today. That came somewhat later. After that, the next earliest mention I found is in 1740, when there was an incident involving a forged banknote here at the Lower Flask in Hampstead. Today it is a Young's pub, and I believe has been for quite some time. Is it getting on for 100 years now? I went for a half of London Original. Here's a look at what was on the bar lineup. Basically just that, one other beer. Oh well. Pub number 8, and we're now on Hampstead High Street. This is the King William IV. Cheers from the King William IV. It is a listed building, and Historic England date it quite specifically to between 1830 and 1837, which is of course the reign of the monarch after whom the pub is named. I think it's a really nicely intact piece of late Georgian architecture, which has barely changed, externally at least, in practically 200 years. The ground floor frontage around what presumably would have originally been the main entrance is particularly appealing, albeit often partly obscured by these two competing, I believe, crepe stalls. The door is flanked by two bowed windows. Those bowed windows have what I believe is called Y tracery, intersecting Gothic arches towards the top. And similarly, the light over the door has intersecting circles, which I wonder if you can call O tracery. It's in a way a similar kind of design, but I suppose if it doesn't have Gothic arches, then you can't call it tracery. You can just imagine this scene lit up by gas lamps and some suitably Dickensian character scurrying in or out. Inside, I think it's an interesting, eclectic mix of old and new. There is a certain amount of neon lighting inside, definitely on the new side of things, and there's also this curious red piano in one corner. But there are also other tropes of more traditional pub styles, knickknacks hanging from the ceiling and so on. There's also a collection of photos and information about famous Hampstead residents around some of the walls. We should talk about the pub name, King William IV. At the start of King William's reign, in 1830, there was a pivotal piece of legislation called the Beer House Act, which effectively deregulated the sale of beer. It meant that you just had to pay an annual licence fee of 2 guineas, £1 and a shilling, and then you could sell beer in just about any premises. So there was an explosion of pubs in the wake of that, and many of them took the name King William IV or some variation thereof, I suppose in part as a kind of thank you to the particularly laissez-faire style of governance under his reign. However, in the case of this particular pub, I don't actually think that is the origin, as according to the pub wiki site, the pub did exist prior to 1830. Piggott's Directory of 1826 lists all the inns, taverns and public houses of Hampstead at that time. And of course we wouldn't expect prior to 1830 to find a pub called King William IV. However, the pub wiki site suggests that the pub at that time named King George III was in fact the precursor to King William IV. You can see the pub marked here on the 1860s OS map with a PH for public house. And it was the tradition at that time to not mark pubs that were beer houses. So I think that's further evidence that it was in fact a fully licensed public house at that time, not a beer house, and did not therefore likely originate in the 1830s under the reign of King William IV. Today it's an independent pub. Here is a look at what was on the bar lineup. I went for a half of Courage Directors. I'm quite enjoying this. Pub number 10, and oh dear, we're in double digits now. The Freemasons Arms on Downshire Hill. Cheers from the Freemasons Arms. I have to admit, in my original plan for this outing, I was just going to skip this altogether because I've always thought of it as a very, very gastro-leaning pub. And I know I've said that about several of them here in Hampstead. Camera's description for the pub opens with the term roomy gastropub and then goes on to say that it is very popular with young professionals. I don't know about you, but neither of those things filled me with much faith that I was actually going to enjoy this place. It's not a listed building, however it does have some notes from Camden Council. Is that possibly something like a local listing, as some of these London Borough Councils do? According to them, it is a 1936 Neo-Georgian rebuild, and quite unusually for those interwar Neo-Georgian pub rebuilds, it's actually stucco rendered and painted rather than bare brick as most of them are. The architect was Sidney Charles Clark, and I think that's probably what swung me over to actually coming here rather than just sniffily passing it by, as we've seen many of his pubs before in previous videos. He was the chief architect for Charrington's at that time, suggesting that this was therefore a Charrington's pub. The main entrance and the windows either side are actually a bit reminiscent of that King William IV frontage. It has that Y tracery again and bowed windows either side of the door. Along with the scrolled pediment over the top of that and these Corinthian capitals, I think it's actually quite a handsome assemblage. Inside, I don't think there are any remnants of that 1930s rebuild or any earlier material. It very much gives a sense of a modern gastropub per camera's opening roomy gastropub description. It is all very light and airy. There are some high skylights in some parts of the pub and a lot of regrettably turquoisey, greeny, bluey, whatever that colour is, paint all over the place. The pub goes back to at least 1821, at which time it was up for sale and was advertised as the Freemasons Arms Tavern, tea gardens and public house. A singularly eligible and rapidly improving concern, delightfully situated on Downshire Hill, Hampstead. The pub is associated with the game of Pall Mall, which is effectively a precursor to croquet. It is believed that the famous street in St James's, which I think also gets onto the Monopoly board, doesn't it, was named after that game, and also somehow that name contributed to shopping centres in America being called malls. Malls, you say either, I say either. Alas, the Pall Mall Circle, which I think is the pitch or field that the game was played in, was lost in the late 20th century owing to an unscrupulous landlord of the time. Today it's another Mitchells and Butlers pub, and it's under their, is it called something like Premium Country Dining brand or something? Yet another brand of Mitchells and Butlers. Just one cask ale on, just one hand pump, but it was a particularly interesting choice. I do feel I have to take my hat off to them. This is Landlord Dark. I'm not sure I quite understand how to describe this stylistically. Is it something like a porter version of Landlord, which is a strange concept, but whatever it is, it's very nice. Pub number 11 and the final stop on today's tour of Hampstead pubs, it's the Magdala. Let's take a look at the exterior first. I don't think this is a listed building, but we do have some brief notes from cameras listing more for the interior rather than the exterior. The building itself is of the 1860s, and cameras notes comment on how it follows the curve of the street. I believe this street is called South Hill Park, which winds its way up to Hampstead Heath. It had an extensive makeover in the 1930s, and that's the era to which all of the interior dates to. And I wonder if at least some parts of the exterior actually also come from that date as well. This tiling looks more 1930s than 1860s to me. It's described as buff faience tiling by camera. There is a centrally placed lobby as you enter, and then there are two main rooms beyond that. I believe the left-hand side room would originally have been the public bar, and the right-hand side room would have been the saloon bar. Interestingly, today the former public bar has been converted into more of a dining devoted area, and the saloon bar is the one that feels more pubby, more like a bar. Camera's listing focuses more on the saloon bar side. They note particularly that the bar counter has that characteristic curving of the 1930s, and that somewhat reflects the curving of the whole building. At the time of that 1936 makeover, it was a Charrington's pub, and you can tell that in part because of the windows. They have that characteristic green trim around the edges. We've seen that in several pubs before in these videos, including the Tamil Crown, which was formerly known as the Charles Lamb in Islington, the Cooper's Arms in Kilburn, and the Albert in Primrose Hill. They all have that very similar style, green edged, green trimmed stained glass windows. Let's talk about the name, the Magdala, which I'm quite possibly mispronouncing. Given the timing, it seems almost certain that it referred to the Battle of Magdala in 1868. That's the Magdala in Ethiopia, today known as Amber Mariam. We can be fairly sure about that establishment date of the 1860s because the street that it was on was not laid out until then. You can see that on this OS map surveyed in 1866, and although Hampstead Heath Station was present at that time, that was built in 1860. The street itself was yet to be developed, and north of there was just fields. Here is a slightly later OS map. I think this is from the 1890s for contrast. So it seems likely the pub was established almost immediately after the Battle of Magdala in 1868, and here is a newspaper advert for the pub in 1869, at which time it seems to have been newly built. Of course, we can't talk about the pub without mentioning that fateful Easter Sunday night in 1955 when racing driver David Blakely was shot dead outside the pub. Ruth Ellis was found guilty of his murder, and the case is still remembered today because she was the last woman in England to be given the death penalty. Like the White Bear, this is another pub that has endured an extended period of closure in recent years. I believe it was from 2015 to 2021, but today it has happily been revived by the Morgan Pub Company. They're another small pub co, and we've encountered a couple of their pubs before, like the Lyric in Soho and the Express Tavern in Brentford. Their pubs always seem to have quite an impressive beer lineup. Very happy to find Harvey Sussex Best on the bar here. Here's a look at what else was on offer. I believe they have also earned some plaudits from the local camera branch for their real ale selection. Okay, that is going to be it for today's tour of Hampstead pubs. I'm heading home by way of Hampstead Heath. I think it's been quite a good run today. Surprisingly, managed to find beers I actually want to drink in every single pub. Even the pubs that I thought were going to be awful gastropub monstrosities. So well done Hampstead on this occasion. You put in a good show. So thanks very much for watching. I'm going to go and take a look at the view on Parliament Hill. I'll see you on the next one.